when I was referring to policing as reactive, not proactive, a question came through, and I assume this is what it was talking about. It says, isn't that part of what is wrong with policing? That there is nothing to do unless you need to react. And that is the opposite of community policing, isn't it? That was the question that was put forward. So that's a great question, because I think that's a question that a lot of the community actually has. But I would answer a question with a question first before getting into it. Okay, and the question that I would ask is this: how many other professions out there have to go out and actually try to make a good impression on everyone before they go out and do their job? Like, how many professions do you have to get in front of what's going to happen? Now maybe sales, you want a good reputation for your company so you can then go sell a product, right? But that's actually kind of the most similar connection that we're talking about, right? Where I want somebody to be happy about the service I'm providing, but that means there must be a reality, right? That what I offer is reactive, right? I'm going to have to come in and take an action in an environment where that action may not be supported by everybody. Or I may have to arrest a family member that somebody doesn't want arrested, or I may have to stop somebody from getting to a family member who's been injured in a car accident, as was mentioned, or I may have to again, go in and serve a warrant on somebody's house or somebody's property when their kids are inside. To me, that actually speaks to the reactive nature of the profession, that we actually have to go out and have programs in advance to try and ease the impact of doing the job on the community. But yes, is that the basis of community policing? The answer is yes, right? I would articulate that the crisis intervention movement, one of the greatest areas of liability that I was always concerned about with starting a crisis intervention team was doing follow-ups, because that's part of the way that we would try and bridge the gap between folks that were mentally ill and calls for service with law enforcement. So every time there was a call for service, it would generate, an officer would go out, they would deal with it, and there would be a report generated. That report would then come to me, and then as a result of that, I would read those reports, try and figure out what actions were taken, and then as a team, we would go out and do a follow-up with the individual who was mentally ill and try and figure out, have they received services, what could we do? What information can we provide them? How was their encounter with us? Were there any questions we can ask about why things we were done? But I was always desperately afraid of knocking on a door without actually a reason to be there, without having been called to the location, in other words, right? So we're doing this extra community effort to try and improve relations, but I could get somebody who's in a full-on mental health crisis behind that door, and now all of a sudden it goes bad because I'm there and they see the uniform, and now I've got to explain that, and I don't have reasonable suspicion or probable cause to be there, right? Based on legal doctrine. Now I'm just trying to do a community service. So this was always a concern, and nobody has really legislated that or articulated that as to how that would be dealt with, which opens up a new area of fear. Now, the purpose of community policing is to go out and put officers in publicly accepted events or venues, speak to the community directly, like schedule times to be out there. And for a lot of large organizations, that's a full-time job. Like, they're going out and setting up events, and it's very structured and organized. Now, the routine officer who's on the street, he utilizes community policing or culturally sensitive policing by going out, and if he has downtime, trying to basically just, make conversation with people. Like, you see somebody in a squad car, stop them, hey, how you doing, what's going on, And it is true, the better like your little community, your beat. So, in large agencies, a small section of territory is a beat. It's the smaller, and the more you know the people there, like, they may even potentially give you information when they need it, or they may come to trust you. Okay, well, again, I think that's a good thing. The problem is that they've got to trust the uniforms. This is one thing I would say. So one way I would answer this question is that, is it true the police is reactive, and is that a problem? Well, there are some natural barriers to overcome to it not being reactive. Number one, you don't have the same officers 24/7 patrolling the same beat in the community. So you may have 3 to 4 different shifts of officers that are rotating through, and so somebody may trust one officer, but they may not form a connection with the other one. So they have to trust the uniform as a whole, which is something that a lot of times the community is not always doing, right? So officers want to be seen as individuals, but they also have to be respected as a whole, as a group, for community policing to kind of work, And so some of that burden falls back on the community to ask themselves, what are their views of law enforcement? Is this really somebody that helps, right? So, but you go out, and when you're on your beat, you try and make contact and try and interact with people. I think it's a great idea, and I think, yes, it's good for there to be community policing. And I would say that So, but I wouldn't say it's proactive. I would say that it's reactive, if you will, right? Because the nature of the profession is reactive, and I'm having to do something to prepare for that to occur. So is that proactive as far as pursuing relationship or improvement in relationship? Probably, but it doesn't change the nature of the profession as a whole. And the other thing I would say is that community policing is great if you're looking at regular officers to do it on their beats. But what happens when they come in division-wide, there's 75 or 100 calls for service holding? Like, one of the problems is how is manpower, how you're stretching the number of officers you have over a particular area and how much time you have to make a sustained connection. Not to mention, I used to tell every single police officer that worked underneath me that I will pay or another officer will pay for how poorly they handle the call with somebody. If you don't do it right, then the next officer that goes out there is going to face the interaction that you had with them. And that's a reality. If it's a bad encounter, they're going to be more guarded about dealing with you. And so, they need to recognize too that they're a part of something as a whole. So I think it would be great, in some of what, some of the increasing of social services and this sort of thing are some of the suggestions that are being made with the defunding argument to try and allocate resources into different areas to be proactive in the community. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm all about improving the mental health of the community, just like I'm all about improving the mental health of law enforcement officers. But one of the things that I would ask is, why haven't those programs been successful so far, widespread? One of the things I would say is because the science isn't being taught. It's not being, again, I go back to this, right? It's not being universally accepted as this is a way to heal and have things improve, to give everybody a foundation from which to start from. So there's some negative views, and again, there's how much money is there to go around. It would be great.
If we go out to a domestic violence case, we're not going to be able to convince that man that he shouldn't beat his wife or that she should leave.
Right. You're battling against memory networks that may have thousands of experiences in them, and yet you're trying to create a single change. This is what I understand about neurophysiology. When I'm under threat or when something happens, I'm going to revert to whatever I've stored about how to handle that. That's what we talk about, the stress response. And so to create a lasting change in there, you've got to have some pretty consistent, focused attention on that also requires willing participation from the community in that. I think a big question that needs to be answered is, if you're going to be successful with allocation of services or money towards services away from law enforcement, is how receptive is the community going to be to showing up to receive those services? They have to do the work too, exactly.
But it does reduce, actually in the long run, it does help with costs. Just at the beginning, it's
right.
Hard to start out. But once you have that relationship, that community-based relationship, crime actually goes down in those areas.
It can, for sure, without a doubt.
Statistically, it always does here. I know that.
Yeah. It's just there's got to be a concerted effort to get the community invested. Like I said, that's why you can't. It seems nearly impossible to solve this problem looking at one side without looking at the other. Like, if you want the burden to not be on law enforcement, there have to be less situations that we have to respond to. But then there also has to be the support when they have to respond. Like, when it's out of control and the police are needed, then there has to be support for when they arrive. But yeah, take as much out of their handling as possible. But also consider what's going to happen if you send folks that are untrained to protect themselves into situations that, where there isn't safety there. That's why even like in crisis intervention, which is probably one of the closest models to being successful with this, and it has, across the United States, reduced calls for service and helped get people to services when they're not in so much of a crisis state by doing some of these follow-ups, even though there really hasn't been any sort of, that I know of legislatively or case law-wise, any sort of basic variables or boundaries on interacting in those ways, right? It has made a difference, but even then, a lot of times you're sending a social worker out with a law enforcement officer for protection. So you just don't want to see people get hurt in situations where things could go bad. Just can't count on good conduct from people all the time when they're not potentially in their right mind or don't really want the service that's being provided. So I hope that answered the question.